Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Candace Nortey, an esteemed educator, cultural curator, and an innovator who is now Sloan Partners' inaugural Executive Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
All right. Good morning, everyone, as you're joining us. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled you're joining us for our virtual breakfast series. Thanks to our sponsors, TriNet, for sponsoring our breakfast series this month. We're thrilled to have them with us. And today we have a very special guest to talk about things that sometimes we don't like to talk about, but it's really important right now that we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the life sciences space and things that we can do as individuals, as a community, and as companies to really make sure we're providing the most thorough opportunities for everybody. And that will lead to better cures, better treatments, and better patient outcomes. So I'm going to kick it over to Derek to introduce our guest. One housekeeping piece: if you would like to ask questions, and we hope you will, both through the chat and the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, you can type those and we'll feed them to Candace as we can. So welcome. We're glad you're here. Derek?
Thank you. All right, Candace, good morning. After the discussions we've had with you, I'm super excited for today. And as we were saying, that we usually start these with a bit of an origin story for where our guests came from. And yours is fantastic because you have had basically an award-winning career in education, and somehow through some series of events, you have wound up, as the person who's heading up diversity, equity, and inclusion for a recruiting firm in the life sciences, which, most people say on this program that they didn't follow the path that people usually follow to get there, but you really didn't follow the path that people usually follow to get here. So can you talk a little bit about literally where you came from, how you got into education, and where you were before? And then we'll talk a little bit about how you transitioned into the life science industry.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. So yes, I knew from the time I was a little girl that I wanted to be a teacher. I babysat all the neighborhood kids. I was a camp counselor. So when I went to Indiana University in Bloomington, it was no surprise that I majored in elementary education. I was a classroom teacher, an instructional coach. I went back to school at Indiana University and got a master's in educational leadership and my principal's license. And one day I decided that I wanted to make a bigger impact, and I threw my hat in the ring and I started my career in administration. I've served as assistant principal, and director, most recently before joining Sloan Partners. And every role I took on, I wanted to make a bigger impact. I wanted to impact more students, more families. I wanted to have a bigger lens in the education sector. So I had a great career serving beautiful children, awesome families, and the most amazing teaching staff ever before landing at Sloan Partners. And in all, I was in the education field traditionally for almost 20 years.
And then out of the blue, you said, I think I'm going to go fix science.
Well, I will say that once it was announced, Facebook official, right? A lot of the comments were like, wait a minute, what happened? And really, it was an opportunity to continue that idea of making a bigger impact. When I talked to Sloan Partners about what was going on in life sciences with diversity, equity, and inclusion, who's represented, who's a scientist, who's not a scientist, I realized that I had a unique skill set that I could bring to the industry, understanding how schools work, how families think, how kids think about science. Kids love science. So when Sloan Partners talked to me about recruiting and life sciences, which I know nothing about either really, my interest was piqued. Yeah. And I started to listen and think about, could I replicate some of the success I had as a building principal into the life sciences industry? So the school that I became principal of wasn't diverse at all as far as the staff, right? It actually was mostly white women, but our kids were very diverse. We had a lot of Black students. We had a lot of English language learners. And I as I began having the opportunity to hire and add to my staff, I realized that I needed to be really, think really differently about who I was hiring. So that's when I started thinking about, could I do this in life sciences? Could I make an impact? Could I help them, people, our clients, diversify their companies? Could I help make more equitable spaces, more inclusive spaces? I don't think that those things are industry specific.
Mm-hmm. So just to go back to, so Sloan Partners is, actually a nice microcosm for this, right? They're a majority women-owned business. They actually have really good representation on the board. And, for the edification of our audience, your title now is Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, right? So in a lot of ways, they're actually pretty forward thinking about the types of things that they're trying to impact. So how did they find you in the first place? And when they did, what was the first cup of coffee like, right? How did they find you in the first place? And how did they say, by the way, you spent 20 years building this really great career as an educator. We now want you to stop doing that. And we want you to come over here.
It took a lot of coffee.
I bet.
It took multiple conversations with all of their upper leadership team, their founder, their CEO, their president. Also, I spoke with many people on the team about culture, hearing kind of what the culture of Sloan Partners looked like, what they were hoping to do, learning more about the industry. This was about over 3 months process of talking, meeting, emailing, thinking, me talking with my family about what does it mean to walk away from a 20-year career. I was on track to be a superintendent, hands down. And so there aren't that many female superintendents and there aren't that many Black superintendents. And so for my community and my family, I had to really think about, like, is this a good move for me, and what I mean to my community. And so the conversations over coffee were really hard. They were really transparent, really on the heels of the George Floyd incident. Our company that was doing okay, right? Our board was diverse. There was a lot of female leadership. They wanted to do more. They realized that they were in a unique position as a recruiting firm to help in a different way. And I think that's where they're forward thinking, really, because we are placing talent in these life science companies. In particular, we specialize in placing executives, and I feel like we have a responsibility to really share with our clients what's going on, be transparent with them, help them understand what's going on. And so I'm really proud of Sloan Partners for just being different, out of the box. And so that excites me, right? I thrive on innovation, creativity, and autonomy. And so you get to do that every day when you're a building principal. And so when they talked to me about what the possibilities were in life sciences, I was super excited. And I was even more excited when I think about how I still can educate, I still can train, and I still can talk to parents and students about the possibilities in life sciences.
So Candace, we have a lot of, obviously, our audience is broad ranging. And if we literally took a sample of who was on the call now, you'd have everything from, people from large companies, people from service providers, people from startups. In New York, we have a lot of startup size life science companies. So what did you do? This is twofold. One is, what did you do when you first came into Sloan Partners? How did you first make the assessment of changes that you all could make internally? And then secondly, what should companies start thinking of if they're just sort of grappling with, okay, what can we do? Like, where do we start? So
Sure.
2 questions.
So I spent the first couple weeks at Sloan Partners meeting one-on-one with almost everyone in the organization, right? Just listening, trying to understand their role, trying to understand life sciences a little bit, even though to me, it's not really about life sciences or about recruiting. It's about knowing people and being a good communicator and a connector. So I was making connections with them, trying to listen and understand. I also was sharing with them what we were hoping to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion at Sloan Partners. And the reason why that was important, Jennifer, is because they were able to, as they were starting to listen to clients, they would make connections. Even early on, I started joining calls with our clients if that particular company had mentioned or said, we want to do something, right? So that's number one at Sloan, really looking at our culture, looking at, yes, we're diverse, our board is diverse. Yes, we have a lot of female leadership, but our executive team was still very white. And so we had a lot of really hard conversations about how does that happen, right? Even when you have really good intentions. And I call it the referral effect, right? Mm-hmm. You refer who you know, who you go to school with, mm-hmm. who you went to church with. So we talked about how we could do that differently internally and how those lessons internally could help us as we work with our clients, right? How to think differently about our networks. So that's the first thing with Sloan Partners is, and then the last thing with Sloan internally is we have a lot of culture clubs within Sloan, which I think is a really good practice for organizations where I don't think a sole person should be responsible for the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts of a company, right?
Right, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so in that space, I really kind of sit back and let the incredible, talented people at Sloan really lead those internal efforts. And I insert myself really strategically at our retreat, on a call, making a book recommendation, in my culture club, right? Sending a purposeful article after a really deep conversation. We had a really great conversation about, how do we impact our children around this work? Mm-hmm. And so, I don't want to pretend to be an expert, but I have expertise in being a Black female in this world. And I have expertise leading a school with really diverse students.
Yeah.
And so that's internally. To answer your second question, what can companies begin to think about doing? Like, where do you start, right?
Right.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but have you ever tried to do like a DIY project and you just keep like thinking about it and you don't just do it?
Do you want me to show you like the beads back here that I bought because I was going to make my own jewelry?
Listen, I have all the projects, Jennifer, but I think that's human nature, right? So I think one of the things I would say is just start, do something, and you can start by having a conversation. Mm-hmm. You can start by reaching out to other organizations to hear what they're doing. I think that's something that we don't do enough. We all want to like hold these things like close to our chest and not learn from each other.
Yeah.
That's another thing that I spend most of my days doing, meeting one-on-one with CEOs mm-hmm. of our clients and learning about what they think, what they see the needs are, what they feel, and where I can help support them in that. So again, I think if you're just starting, do something, start, mm-hmm. listen, get connected, ask questions, have conversations. I feel like, I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel like racism, systemic racism, implicit bias, all of those things feel kind of taboo, but I think that's changing. People are wanting to talk about it and they should.
So I have a question. And it's based off something that you just said. So this wasn't something we sent to you earlier. For most of the early kind of Zoom meetings that I was on, I found that the first 10 or 15 minutes many times were dedicated more to how's everybody doing, right? And I found that there was a little more willingness for people to share, to talk about where they were, to talk a little bit more about what was happening, around them, much more so than, okay, let's get this meeting started. And, have you seen really a little bit more of a willingness for people to talk almost in a Zoom format? Because you can kind of go around the horn in a Zoom format a little bit. It's harder to kind of talk someone down like you're in a meeting. And I think it's almost like there's a little bit more of an equitable time sharing. Have you seen any of that? Do you almost feel like, having a Zoom format allows people a little bit more space to talk about things they wouldn't normally talk about?
Derek, I actually do. I think, honestly, the pandemic in general allowed for people to be a little bit more informal in all the ways that matter, right? Mm-hmm. And so, your children are in the background, the dog is barking, you're having a rough morning. I think people started to show up with their authentic self to work.
Yeah, I haven't changed out of my Tivas since, May.
I mean, I may or may not have really, really tried this morning for this awesome audience. But no, really, to answer your question, I think because people started to show up more authentically, it allowed for people to ask and say really hard things. So for example, before I came to Sloan Partners, on the Zoom after the whole George Floyd incident, when my supervisor asked, "How are you?" I decided I'm not going to say I'm okay. I'm not going to do the pleasantries of business as usual. I said, you know what? Today really sucks. And that's exactly what I text our CEO at Sloan Partners in the wake of the Breonna Taylor verdict, and also with the comments from the CEO about there not being Black talent. I feel like people are in the Zoom format willing to bring more of their authentic self to work. And I think the format allows for people to share space in a more equitable way.
Yeah, that's really good. And I hope for anything to come out of this, I hope some more kind of healthier ways for people to either express themselves or perhaps connect a little more, in a little more genuine fashion comes out of it and sticks, which is ironic because you would imagine being there in person is a little bit easier, that kind of thing. But we have to separate everyone and put them through Zoom in order for them to be authentic. But if that comes out and that sticks, that's fantastic.
Derek, I think it's like when you cross the threshold of work, like you bring your work self, right? So, what you wear, how you, censor your speech, and all these rules that we've had about, what's taboo in the workplace, right? You can't talk about finances. You can't talk about politics. You can't talk about race, right? So I feel like we're groomed to think that way. And I think because the pandemic showed the human side of everyone, right? I think it opened up a different way of thinking and how we can be with each other in the workspace.
Yeah. So you said something before that I think is important. I think everybody falls into it, and it's the referral effect, right? I think a lot of people, either implicitly or not, when they're hiring people, they look for people that remind them of themselves, or they look for people that, it's almost like they project their ideal of what they used to be onto the candidates that they'd like to hire. And, I imagine this is pretty common just about anywhere. Are there ways to think about breaking out of that pattern? What are some of the ways that you think about that, or ways to have people within the recruiting industry break out of that a little bit?
Absolutely. So a couple things. So we were working with a client who really wanted a diverse candidate and was very specific about the kind of diverse candidate that they wanted. And when the recruiter she reached out to me and wanted to brainstorm, how to support our client. And I asked a question. I said, well, if they worked with other recruiting firms before, were any of this said candidate presented to the company? And we didn't know. And I said, for me, step one is asking, was the diverse candidate even presented to the company? Because the recruiter is the gatekeeper to that, right? Yeah. We're constantly filtering who gets an interview and who doesn't. And so that, to me, that was step one. If in fact that candidate had never been presented, then we have to do work on our side to go to that candidate and say, we think you would be very beneficial to this organization, right? However, if it's that they were presented and they weren't chosen, then there's another conversation to have with the client around criteria, right? Yeah. So I think that's, one thing to think differently is the criteria that the client is wanting. And then as a recruiter, being the gatekeeper of who gets in and how we filter that. I think another thing is thinking about transferable skills. So our CEO saw me. She saw someone who was passionate, smart, award-winning, a great communicator, a connector, right? She didn't see someone that had a degree in science or, had been doing traditional DEI work for years, but I lived diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so I think it's important that clients start thinking about how to look for people that have transferable skills, that have potential, because talent and potential are not race or gender specific. So I think that's another way that we can can help. And then I always go back to like, what did I do to build a team that was inclusive and diverse at my school, right? I slowed down. I wasn't in a rush to hire. I started making interviewing and thinking about who would be value added to our school and not racing to do what's easy or comfortable. And so the referral effect is easy. It's comfortable. Yeah. Hey, I know this great person. And so it's really slowing down and taking the time to think differently, be open to looking for different kinds of candidates and valuing what they bring to the table. And people are coachable, right? People are coachable.
Most people.
What'd you say?
I said most people.
Most. That's true. Most people are coachable. But yeah, so I think that that's something that we all can do a little bit differently to look at who's coming to the table. I also think we need to look at who's in our organization and how can we mentor and support and promote who's in our organization. But if there's no one in there that's diverse, then that's step one. Mm-hmm. And I think, if you look at your board, you can start there, because one thing we were thinking about, every time you add someone who's diverse to your network, to your company, they bring a whole network of people, right? Whether they went to a historically Black college and university, whether they're in a historically Black Greek fraternity or sorority, that network is huge. And I think we are missing out on some really key opportunities to bring diverse candidates to our organizations.
We had a question from our audience, and it says, are there analogies or techniques like orchestras auditioning behind a curtain, for example, that can help companies reduce bias when they're bringing in new hires?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the way that we write our job descriptions is one way that we can reduce bias, right? Because that's like who's even attracted and applying.
Right.
I do think that, we just make judgments quickly. All of us do, based on everything, right? Yeah. It's just human nature. So I think perhaps interviewing without the screen on at first. I think removing candidate names on applications would be helpful. There's a lot of research around, people with unique names being discriminated against because there's an assumption there. Mm-hmm. So I think those are some, quick and easy ways that you can do that, removing name, to not really know gender or ethnicity. Again, I think you can interview without the screen on to hear. I mean, I think that would have been interesting today. I wonder if people would have known I was a person of color today, outside of it being a traditional role to be in diversity, equity, and inclusion and be, right. So yeah.
So in thinking about this, we think about the kind of the assumptions and like the criteria that people place on new candidates. And that often filters down to, where do they go to school? Where do you do your graduate work and everything? So we probably have several filters in place that, almost implicitly start to narrow whoever our pool is before we even hire people, right? And the challenging thing is, in science, you have really a long run up to be qualified for a particular position. Do you feel like we're really constrained by what those criteria are? Whether it's within a scientific field, whether it's within, pulling people out of certain universities, how do you start to overcome that?
That's a great question, Derek. I think one of the things I've been thinking about since the CEO made that comment about there not being Black talent to fulfill a particular role, I think it's not one answer. I think it's a both and answer. Yeah. I do think there are certain roles, like to be a superintendent in Indiana, you have to have an EDS. You just do. And, unless you're going charter, right? And so, if you're in the traditional school system, that's a criteria that you have to have. It doesn't matter how amazing you were as a school principal, you need to have it. Now, do we sometimes allow for people to become superintendent and let them get that degree? Absolutely. So I think that that's, some criteria is necessary. And so I think we have to look at what's going on in life sciences on all sides of it, right? I think what we can do is some of the roles in life sciences don't require the longevity within the science field. And so that's one way we can start diversifying our organizations. Mm-hmm. But to answer, what do we do to get people who look like me the experience and the education that they need to be ready for those roles? We need to partner with schools. We need to partner with existing organizations. There's a ton of organizations out there that are in place to support girls in STEM, Black students in science. There's a ton of organizations, a ton of teachers on the ground who realize that STEM is important, but they need support. They need support. And so I think part of the conversation to me is really up here, which I love. I love that CEOs are taking action and wanting to think about their supplier diversity. They're thinking about their who's internally. They're thinking about their boards. They're thinking about their C-suite. That's great. But we need to capitalize on the fact that Black kids and Hispanic kids and girls are just as interested in science as their counterparts. And so for me, the question is, what happens, right? If they love science, they love STEM, and I know this for a fact firsthand because I had a STEM lab at my school, and girls, there was no race or gender that seemed more interested in STEM or not, right? And so we need to nurture their love for STEM. We need to show them the pathway and career way to get into STEM. And we need to also talk to their parents about what it means to be in science, right? Derek, you and I had a really rich conversation about how ambiguous it is to say, go be a scientist, right?
Yep.
And I'm going to tell you, as a Black person who, went on to get a degree and even a graduate degree, my parents weren't saying, go be a scientist. They wanted something more tangible that they knew I could make a good living. And I think that's every parent if you're, first generation. So just explaining to them how science can be the new law degree and how you can do so many things with a science degree is really critical for us to diversify this industry.
And it will take schools with our support, I think, adopting programs that focus on, so I know I have a high school freshman. I know it's hard to believe that I'm old enough to have a freshman, but he is taking a science research course that goes all the way through school. And I didn't have anything like this in my, small rural school, but it allows them to look at science and research and development, and they'll get internships in the summer and even as high schoolers to the extent that they can make a difference in labs. But it's those kinds of programs that make sure they're encouraging all the kids who have an interest in it. And so I feel like we've got this end to end, right? We need more C-suite talent that's diverse, but then we also have to encourage this. It's almost like this 20-year, it keeps on going, right? It's a flywheel, and we need to populate the flywheel with enough interest from kids that are diverse so that when the time comes for them to come out of college and go into the professional world, they're there. We have a robust talent pool. And I think that those types of programs, we as industry need to get behind and really support them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Explaining,
I agree.
there was go ahead.
Well, one thing I'll say, I agree 100%. I think we need to support programming that exposes students to the life sciences and what the possibilities are. One thing we have at Sloan Partners is our Envision program. And right now, as it stands, it's really about looking at minority students who are in life sciences that are nearing graduation and hooking them up with a mentor that's an executive so that they can transition into the field with support, guidance, help with their resume, help with their LinkedIn profile. But what I bring to Sloan Partners is the unique perspective that you're touching on, Jennifer, is that it's not too late, but it's not enough. There won't be enough diverse candidates if we solely focus on that. So we're really expanding Envision to be more of a continuum to find those programs like at your child's school and help industry get connected with those programs. And so that's what I spend the other part of my day, right? Is meeting with a lot of venture firms that want to do something actionable. They want to mentor, they want to expose. And so connecting them with students and existing organizations is another part of our Envision program at Sloan Partners. Last thing I'll say to what you said, it's about long game, right? There are some things that you can do immediately to show that you're vested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But if you really want to make an impact, it has to be a strategy that's about the long game. Because honestly, if you Google diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is the same conversation we had 10, 15, 20 years ago in every industry that isn't diverse, right?
Yep. Yeah, we had a question that followed this, although it's not really a question, but it's an important point. And this person says, as a former Hispanic professor in biomedical sciences, what happens is that you go up the ladder to continue pursuing a scientific career, you find less support with mentorship, with funding, and with support from senior colleagues. And they say it becomes really difficult to do science in isolation, right? So I think this really speaks to what you're talking about, where there needs to be that continual mentorship to help people continue to progress and not get to a point where you're stagnant or where you're isolated or where you're kind of pushed into a corner.
Thank you for that comment. You know what, guys? That's not industry specific either. When I went up the ladder in my educational career and became a principal, there was no support or mentorship for me. It was a very challenging first couple of years. Truly, there was so much privilege at the school that I inherited. There was a singular way of thinking. Most of the teachers were from that district as a student. They went to the same college, which is the same degree program, and they'd only taught a singular grade within that corporation. So the thinking was so limited. And here I come to this organization, young, Black, female. I had worked at 3 school districts at that point, very diverse, very different clientele, right? I had very, very, very involved parents and very, very caring, but more of a working class parent clientele. And so when I got to my school, it was painful. There was a painful couple of years where I thought, maybe I'm not supposed to be a principal. And I'm so glad I stuck it out. I'm so glad that as every opening happened at my school and I filled it with someone that had more different experience, right? That had different teaching experiences. They looked different, different ages. The culture of our school began to change. And it was amazing. We ended up having the highest student achievement. We had a waiting list a mile long. Everybody wanted to work there or send their student there, period. And I truly attribute that to the diversity, equity, inclusion that we did as a staff on the ground to change that. So thank you for that comment, because it's not industry specific, it's systemic. And women and Black and Hispanic staff experience that. The higher they go up, you feel so isolated and you feel so unsupported. And I think, we keep talking about this pipeline and this trajectory, but I think people exit at lots of points along the way because of those feelings.
We also, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, just while we're on this, let me ask you, what was the hardest part? Was there a part where you thought it wasn't working, you thought something was risky, you weren't really sure how something was going to work out? Because in some ways you can look back at hindsight and you see the things that you did and the things that you achieved, which is fantastic. But if you go back to either the first couple, was there ever a point where you really weren't sure if it was going to work, or it wasn't working, or it was just harder than you thought it was going to be? Because that's probably where a lot of people find themselves in the first decision that they have to make. At what point was it the hardest?
Oh boy. Yes to all of that. It was so hard. It was so painful. I couldn't believe that what I had done in other schools as an instructional coach, as a classroom teacher, like it wasn't working, right? And I was like, and I thought, well, is it because I'm the principal, I'm the CEO, I'm their manager? Is it the role? And honestly, it's both the role and the systemic nature of how things work. And so I think what really, really turned it around was the moment I had an opening I started getting really strategic about how I filled those roles.
Yeah.
I no longer was taking any referrals from anyone existing in the organization, because to me it was toxic and it was just more of the same. And so I was so savvy and strategic about every teacher that I added. When my head custodian job opened up, I promoted a custodian that had been with our organization. She had been a custodian for 14 years, had never been a head custodian. She was both female and Black, right? And so I started to put people around me who believed that all kids could learn, that every parent had value. And so, yeah, I think everyone gets to that point where it's like, this isn't working, right? And I tried everything, right? I tried, let's just be real. I tried being more friendly. I tried including the people who treated me the most poorly in my team, on my book club. I tried to get input. I tried being quiet, right? I tried all of these things. But when I returned to my authentic self, and my authentic self was, I'm a kid's first principal. So we make decisions that are best for kids, right? And I'm going to help lead organizations and help our clients make decisions that are best for life sciences, right? And it's clear that the more diverse thinking we have, the more inclusive culture we have, the better our organizations will be. And as Jennifer started to call, we can find cures for diseases, be more innovative, right? We can do things that will really help everyone. And so yeah, I tried a lot of things that didn't work, that you think you're supposed to do when you're a manager or a CEO. And when I returned to doing the next right thing, even though it still was really hard, that's when I started to make an impact. That's when they realized that either they were going to be a part of this inclusive culture that thought every kid, no matter what, could do what we needed them to do. They could learn, they could achieve, or they needed to leave. And I want to tell you that many of my staff left. By the time I transitioned to being a director, I had hired 95% of the staff. There were some existing employees, but a lot of, and that was hard, right? I had to understand that wasn't about me. I didn't have to take it personally, that those people needed to move on. I needed them to move on to build an inclusive culture.
The status quo wasn't acceptable anymore, and they had to understand that. And if they couldn't, then they were better served working somewhere else.
That's right.
Yeah.
We did have another, we actually had a good question. It's how, are there any other industries that have done diversity well, right? Are there industries that are diverse, and can we learn lessons from them? We'll put it to the like U.S. industries. So yeah.
Yeah.
So.
That's a good question. Well, okay, let me say this. I think every industry, just like with every other business strategy and practice, can do better and can do more, right? And I do think there are some lessons or things that people are doing well. And I do want to say one thing about the life sciences industry. I am so encouraged by the one-on-one meetings I've had with CEOs, HR leaders, people who are in charge of talent. They are so wanting to do something different this time. I truly believe that in my heart. I hope I'm not being naive. The conversation feels different this time. The actions feel different. So I do want to say I'm encouraged by the willingness for our industry to want to listen, to want to collaborate, to want to learn, to want to understand. There are companies that are willing to give up board seats to make room for more diverse candidates. I think that's one thing that I've seen in other industries happen that I think is really a good thing to do. Like, how many boards do you need to sit on, right? Let's make room for some different people. I think that there are people who are being more vocal about, hey, we haven't gotten this right. So I think that's important. There are industries where, and individual companies that I love that are being more visible on their website about their stance on diversity, what they're wanting to do and hoping to do. I'm encouraged by organizations that are setting measurable, actionable, and achievable goals. And there are examples everywhere, right? Like, I live in Indiana, and Ivy Tech is the largest community college in the state, and in some regards in the country. And so they're doing a lot of really great work. Their stance on diversity, equity, inclusion is very public, very measurable, very action-based. I think they're doing it well. So yeah, it's a good question. I think there are lots of industries that are trying to do something differently now. And I'm encouraged by the conversation, but really it'll take action, right? When you put your time, your talent, and your treasure into what you believe, that's when I know you're serious. It can't be lip service. It can't be a quote on your website. It honestly can't even be hiring a Black person in and of itself, right? It has to be time, talent, and treasure.
Yep, we talked about that the other day, and that's really important. It can't be, I think we tend to focus on metrics here or there, but you can't just necessarily point to a scoreboard. It kind of has to be something that you live every single day and that you dedicate yourself to every single day, because if you're not doing that, then, I think it probably comes out, eventually that it was superficial. So we had a question a while back that I think
I was going to say it's my term is virtue signaling, right? If you just post it on Facebook or whatever and then move on and don't do anything differently, all you've done is attempted to signal your own virtue and not actually move the needle.
You want to make yourself feel better, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not helping because we are still where we are in 2020. It was funny. I saw this thing on LinkedIn where they were talking about some of the dictionaries are starting to capitalize the word Black. And I just had to shout out my university, my alma mater, because 20 years ago, I have a minor in African American studies, and the professors kind of told us then, you need to capitalize that. So I'm saying that anecdote to say that was 20 years ago. So we're just now starting to get with the program.
So we had a good question a little while ago, and I'm going to combine it with another one that we were going to touch on. And the question was, what should companies look for if they're hiring ahead of DEI, right? What kind of skills, what kind of attributes, and, importantly, should the candidate be someone of color, right? And just for a thread on this, we at New York Bio are starting an initiative for equity, diversity, and inclusion. So if organizations are starting to move in these areas, what are some of the things that they should think about, right? To stay away from virtue signaling, right? What are some of the things they should think about to make what they're doing really impactful?
Okay, so 3 questions. What should you be looking for in your DEI leader? Does it have to be a person of color? And then what are some things to be thinking about when you're getting started or starting up an initiative? Is that?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. I had a conversation with you about this, Derek. My definition of a DEI thought leader, right? So when you're hiring someone, you're looking for someone who's a thought leader, who's a thinker, right? Someone who's a good communicator, who can connect with people. I think, it helps if it's a person of color or a woman, because they've had that experience that can help really. I think storytelling is powerful, right? And I think when you had some experiences around diversity, equity, and inclusion, it can be impactful. Now, does it have to be a person? I don't want to say that. I don't want to talk in absolutes. I think it's helpful if it's a person of color or a female leading that effort. But I want to go back to what I said earlier. It can't be a singular person to move that needle within your organization, or you're not going to move it. We've had DEI directors and executives and vice president, whatever title you want to put in front of it for years, right? And here we are. So, but is the role important? Yes. Do you have to have that role? No. You have to have a DEI thought leader. You have to have multiple people vested in the work at your organization. So that's number 1. To answer, that's number 2, right? Does it have to be?
Yeah.
Some other skills that I think that make a great DEI leader. Someone who's not afraid to have hard conversations. I think that our CEO at Sloan Partners recognized that was a skill that I had honed over the years as an educator. Let's think about a few things. Have you ever had to tell a parent that their student isn't learning? Typically, that's not an easy conversation to have, right? It's heartbreaking and it's really hard, but you have to be transparent and honest. Have you ever had to tell a teacher that their instruction is not impacting students in the way that it needs to, that their data doesn't meet the standard of high achievement? That's really, really hard. And then also, the higher you go up, when you're a building principal, I realized this as I moved up. I was like, wow, I really was shielded from a lot of the hard conversations as an assistant principal, right? You're talking with people at different stages of their life. So some are going through divorces, some are experiencing infertility, some of your older staff, their parents are aging and they're navigating care at a later stage in life. So I think you need someone who is not afraid and has had experience having really difficult conversations, because that's really important in order to move the needle. So that would be, my top three is, a good communicator, someone who can have hard conversations, and someone who people can relate to and connect with. And then the last question you asked is, as New York Bio is starting their own initiative and getting out there, I really had some time to think about that, and I wanted to share what I think you might be thinking about. First, I think that whenever you come up with your initiative or your solutions, if they're not tied to time, talent, and treasure in the end game, I don't think they're going to make an impact, right? But some of the things to be thinking about are as follow. One, I think you should set a consistent and ongoing time to meet, right? What's that phrase? What gets scheduled gets done. And so you need to schedule it. That's how I felt as an evaluator of teachers. If it wasn't on my calendar, I wasn't in classrooms giving feedback about instruction. So you got to schedule it. You have to be willing to engage in hard and uncomfortable conversations. You can't avoid it. You just can't. You have to be vulnerable, right? You have to be willing to take risks. Sloan Partners took a huge risk by being an executive search firm who hired an executive to lead diversity, equity, and inclusion, both for our company and for our clients. That was a really out of the box thought. And I think it's important because we all have a responsibility around this work. And as I mentioned before, as a search firm, we are a gatekeeper to candidates. And we also have those relationships with clients to really help them understand. The other thing I think that's important is that who you invite to be on your board or a part of your initiative, you need to have different people from different industries. As I mentioned, as a school leader, I realized that everyone at my school was thinking the exact same way. And so there was no way we were going to be able to move our student achievement. We were not in first place by any stretch of the imagination when I got there. And I think it's because we kept doing the same thing. And we kept thinking the same way about instruction and about the students that we were serving. So really invite different people, different backgrounds, different thought processes, right? To really, really think about how we can go about this differently. I think another important thing is to be willing to ask hard questions, right? Get off the surface level and ask the hard questions. Like, why are we here? What's going on really? Because it's really systemic. And I don't think anyone's willing to talk about how this problem is really systemic. It's rooted in our systems. And you have to be willing to empower people who haven't normally had any power, be willing to step aside and hand over that power. And that's hard, right? It's hard to give up something that you feel like you've worked really hard for, or that you've earned, or maybe that you haven't earned, that's privilege, right? And then I think the last thing I'll say on this one is to be willing to put an actionable plan in place. You can talk all day, which is great. We need these hard conversations. You can think, you can, but you need to have action. And I know I said that was the last one, but I do have one more. I do think that everyone's searching for this one right answer. There isn't one right answer, right? And there's not just one answer. So I think the moment we realize that there's not one right answer or only a single answer to this problem, I think we'll be able to be more innovative and creative in solving it.
Well, and we talked about this, I think, on Friday afternoon. So our tendency, and a lot of executives, and maybe this, it's just my personality, you want to fix it, right? If there's an issue, we see a gap, okay, let's just fix it. And so I think in this instance, there is a lot of, okay, let's fix it. Let's be more diverse. Let's take care of it. But I think what you're saying and what a lot of other leaders are saying is this is a longer process. So I'm asking you now, like, where do we start looking for gaps? How do we identify, what kind of data do we need to get to be able to get to your 6 and 7, which is the action plan and no right answer, right? Like multiple ways to address it, an action plan, but how do we figure out where our gaps are? And I'm speaking sort of locally, you know, New York based at this point.
Sure. Well, here's the thing. I think there's like a zillion data points about it all, right? There's data about the number of students that are Black and Hispanic who receive STEM education, right? There's data about, you know, how interested Black students are in STEM. There's data about how many C-suite executives are women, how many, so the gaps are there, the data is there. I think, you know, kind of maybe what you're asking is like, how do you, you know, pick an action to start closing the gap, right? And I think for me, it's like twofold. Like, what can we do immediately to make an impact? And what can be something more long-term that we have to keep working at so that when we look up, we're having different conversations. I think that's really what everybody wants. I just want to have a different conversation, right? I have a 15-month-old. I do not want to be having this same conversation when she begins to navigate going to middle school, high school, and college and choosing her career path. I want to have a different conversation. I want there to be a lot more diversity in this industry and others. And so I want to be talking about, like, when the caller asked earlier, what industries are doing it really well. I want to be able to list off what industries are doing it really well and what actions that they took to do that so that we can start replicating it and having more inclusive industries across the board. So yeah, I think that's really, really important to think about it that way.
Right. So if we kind of project out over the next few years, right, I'm going to make an assumption that, you know, Sloan Partners is going to talk to a lot of companies about what their executive suites look like, right? So if you look out over the next few years, how would you like to see the conversations that you and your team are having with these C-suite teams about the executives they hire change? What are the ways that you see some of the conversations shifting from now to where do you hope they're going to be in a couple of years? Because that's really, that's the direct impact that you and your team can have right now.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we touched on earlier that's related to this question is the criteria and this idea of pedigree, right? I want to start hearing clients being really excited about their networks being different and looking different. And because oftentimes, like, sometimes they are having internal candidates, and I want to hear that conversation be different. I want the internal candidates that have had the mentorship, they've had the promotion, that are diverse, to be considered for the C-suite, right? So I want that to sound different. I want the search criteria that's given to us to sound different. I want it to sound like, you know, not so tied to an Ivy League school, not in some roles that are not so science specific. I want them to be willing and open to say, you know what, we're looking for someone who has potential. We're looking for someone who's innovative. We're looking for someone that can add value to our culture. We're looking for someone that by adding them to our team, our network is more diverse just by adding them to our team, and we can teach and coach and help, you know, bring about some of the other things. I think that that's going to be really, really important. And that's what I want to hear that's different. I also don't want to hear headlines anymore about there being a lack of talent, because there's not a lack of talent. There's not a lack of potential, right? So that's what I want to hear differently with those conversations. And you're right, Sloan Partners has the opportunity to make an impact in the C-suite, but we also have the opportunity to help from this way up, right? With our Envision program, our continuum. And my role is so much bigger than that, because we can work one-on-one with every client to think differently about DEI as a strategy, as opposed to just a statement, you know, some pie in the sky thing that we just can't figure out, right?
Yep. So you mentioned storytelling earlier, which I think is really powerful. And we have probably about 5 minutes left here as we start to look at 10 o'clock. But do you feel like you have an opportunity to kind of make a little bit more of an impact via storytelling? I mean, recruiting is really in a lot of ways a binary thing, right? You're hiring somebody for a specific role at a specific time. But do you feel that through storytelling, you have the ability to kind of change the way that people start to think about things in an incremental manner if you're able to kind of impact the way that they think, either through storytelling or other sorts of examples?
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh. I think the power of storytelling, it's why people go to the movies. It's why people recommend certain novels, right? Because the storytelling is so
Mhm.
powerful. It's why you can sit for coffee for hours because of the storytelling, right? And so, one of the things that I'm hoping to bring to the industry is the power of storytelling, to hear from all aspects, right? From the student to the person sitting, in a company wanting to be promoted. Even my own story is powerful, right? Both how I transformed a school, but also how I made a leap into an industry that I know nothing about in the general sense of life. I don't have a science background. I'm not a recruiter, right? So that story is powerful. And I think we need to tell more stories. We need to tell our stories. I mentor a lot of people that are still in education who are trying to make their way up the leadership ladder, right? And so it's important that we tell their stories and that we start to recognize that they have potential, they have talent. So yeah, I do think we could tell more stories, and I think for me, Derek, it kind of it humanizes the situation. It kind of takes the race out of it, the gender out of it, and everybody loves a great story, right? And so I think if we can tell more stories about students who and women and that can help us start to think differently, because it really is a mindset. It's a mind shift. These things are deeply rooted in us. The systems have been in place for years, and you mentioned earlier, like a lot of it, I do believe is unconscious. You just refer that person without thinking. Your family has always gone with that vendor. Your family always uses that caterer. Your family always uses, so it's just the way we are. And so it's going to take storytelling. It's going to take people willing to be vulnerable, people willing to collaborate and just, not be afraid to take risks in order to impact our industry.
Well, we are unfortunately at the end of our time. I hope that a year from now, we have you back as our guest and we have a conversation about the things the industry has done well and right, and the things that we're starting to put in place that will change so that we don't have to have this conversation again. We have a different one.
Yeah. And I hope you find more platforms to talk about this. And I hope we see you give a TED Talk in the next 2 years, because honestly, your energy and enthusiasm, comes through immediately in all of this. It's incredible. We've been excited all week to have you on, just because, every conversation we have with you is uplifting and inspiring. So, if we can, I hope to see you on TED.com one of these days in front of the stage and the thing and the big graphics and stuff. We can only do so much with our virtual backgrounds. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, New York Bio. And I receive all of that, the TED Talk, and a different conversation a year from now.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
So much. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.